Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I have a return guest with me, Dr. David Pinsof. In our first interview, we talked about the alliance theory of political belief systems, the meaning of life and morality. I'm leaving a link to it in the description down below. And today we're talking about a couple of his Substack posts. Incentives are everything, and opinions are BS. And so we're going to talk about incentives and opinions from an evolutionary perspective. So, David, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you back.
Thanks, Ricardo. I'm glad to be back. As always, a huge fan of the podcast and really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. So let's start with incentives are everything then. And there you start by claiming that behavior is determined by incentives. So what do you mean by that, and what are incentives basically?
Yeah, so the conventional way in which we understand incentives is in terms of money. So economists talk about incentives, working for a particular raise or getting a bonus, or companies can offer incentives like discounts. That's one of the most common ways of thinking about incentives. Occasionally, it's been broadened a bit. You sometimes hear people talk about social incentives. You sometimes hear an analogy to economics in the phrase prestige economy. And I advocate a extreme broadening of the concept beyond what has been conventionally used. So I want to talk about incentives in a way that's broader than money, broader than particular kinds of social rewards, praise and punishment. I want to refer to incentives as literally anything that we want. And since I'm an evolutionary psychologist, I think our basic motivations have been powerfully shaped by natural selection. So if you're going to be an incentive determinist like me, then I think you need to be an evolutionary psychologist like me, because I think evolution is really the only way to understand our basic motivations. I don't see an alternative theoretical perspective for understanding them. Um, so yeah, basically it's a common sense view that what we do is determined by what we want to do, and it's just saying that everything we do is determined by what we want to do, and what we want to do is ultimately determined by natural selection.
And so here, when it comes to the bit about what we want to do and it being determined, are you claiming then that there's no space for free will here, or is there?
It depends. It depends on your definition of free will.
Yeah.
So if you think of free will as being able to do things that we're not motivated to do, or that we have no incentive to do, then yes, there's no free will. But I think there are ways of thinking of free will that are consistent with incentive determinism. You could just think of free will as the ability to respond to your incentives, and that makes a lot of sense of a lot of our punitive institutions and intuitions.
Yeah.
If I am incapable of responding to my incentives, then it really makes no sense to punish me, because the whole point of punishing me is to incentivize me to behave differently. On the other hand, if I am responsive to my incentives, and when I made my decision, I was aware of the potential costs of doing so and the potential punishments, then it makes a lot of sense to punish me, because you are incentivizing me to act differently in the future, and you are incentivizing other people who are like me to act differently in the future. So I think our notion of free will corresponds pretty well to an ability to respond to incentives.
Mm.
And I think a lot of our intuitions and practices surrounding free will can be successfully reframed in those terms. There are some other intuitions that might not translate very well, like this idea that we exist outside of our incentives and we can defy our incentives and pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, or whatever. I think that notion of free will is dumb, for lack of a better word, and hard to reconcile with the view that I'm putting forward.
But then, just for people to understand a little bit better what we're talking about here, would you like to illustrate with a few examples? Give us perhaps 2 or 3 examples of incentives.
Sure. I mean, there are so many. If the concept is as broad as I want to make it, then there are, the
Yeah.
list is endless. But food, sex, status, comfort, health, safety, um, you name it.
So, and you mentioned evolutionary psychology at a certain point there. So where would you say our incentives stem from? Where do they come from?
So yeah, as I said before, I think they come from natural selection. I don't see an alternative theory for where they come from, which means that our basic motivations, and I'm not talking about our instrumental motivations. It might be helpful to back up and talk about the distinction. So the
Mhm.
things that we basically want are the things we want sort of in and of themselves, intrinsically, for their own sake. And you could think about another set of desires as instrumental desires. We want say money because it can buy us food. So the desire for food would be basic, it would be from evolution, and the desire for money would be instrumental. We only want money because it can buy us things like food. If the money can no longer buy us things like food, then we stop wanting money. Whereas we're never going to stop wanting food because that's just built into us, unless of course it conflicts with some other desire, like for status. Maybe I would fast to display my devotion to a particular religious community. And in that sense, incentives can conflict with one another, but you're never going to make one incentive go away. You're never going to make your hunger, for example, go away.
Yeah. So where you come from in terms of your psychological framework, even if cross-culturally, apparently we can find a huge array of different kinds of incentives, would you say that those are simply different cultural manifestations of the same set of underlying evolved motivations?
Yes, I would say so. I think a large part of cultural variation comes from what I would call status games.
Yeah.
And I argue in a post called Status is Weird that status games are very dynamic and constantly shifting because of the paradoxical nature of status. That is, overtly seeking status often lowers your status. And for that reason, becoming aware that we're playing a status game can often make that status game collapse, or at least significantly invert or rearrange the social hierarchy, where those at the top are the ickiest, most vainglorious, narcissistic, selfish status seekers, and those at the bottom are more humble and authentic. So, recognizing a status game can often invert the payoff structure of the game. So, because of that dynamism, that status games are constantly collapsing and reemerging in antithetical forms, you get lots of cultural variation in what gets you status and what lowers your status. So, a big part of cultural variation in our incentive structures are just different ways that we can get status, different strategies we pursue for getting status. What gets you status in one place is going to be different from what gets you status in a different place. But the basic incentive of status is the same.
Right. And are there occasions where conflicts might, or conflict, not conflict, sorry, where incentives might conflict with one another? And if so, how do we deal with conflicting incentives?
Yeah, absolutely. So if incentives are just things we want, then obviously, things that we want can conflict with each other. We experience
Yeah.
this almost every day. Exercising, for example, we might want the long-term health benefits of exercise, but the short-term discomfort might be unpleasant. But if we care more about the long-term health benefits, then that's going to outweigh the short-term discomfort of doing it. Likewise, we could be internally conflicted about doing unethical things like lying or cheating on our spouses. And in that case, there will be a tug of war between the incentive to behave honestly or ethically and the self-interested incentive to cheat or steal or lie or whatever. And I think we resolve those sorts of conflicts in a pretty straightforward way. I think we think about the different outcomes that will result if we take either choice. We play out the scenarios in our head. So ultimately, the way we resolve these kinds of trade-offs, I think, is that the stronger incentive wins. It's pretty straightforward. The more powerful motivation is going to be the one that moves you more effectively.
Okay, but what makes an incentive more powerful than another? I mean, does it have to do with the kinds of incentives we might be considering? Does it have anything to do with the context? I don't know if you want to illustrate that with an example.
Sure. I mean, a big part of it is probably just random genetic variation. So we all have
Okay.
these basic set of evolved motives for food, sex, status, whatever. And just by random roll of the genetic dice, our weightings of these different motivations will be a bit stronger in some of us than in others. Some of us will be more curious or horny or hungry than others. Some of us will be more narcissistic and vainglorious than others, just randomly. So for that reason, which incentives loom larger for any particular individual is going to depend on their particular genetic constellation of traits. And then there's also, environmental and cultural differences about the strength of different incentives. There could be stronger status rewards and punishments in one culture than in another. In one culture, speaking out against the dominant narrative could get you burned at the stake. In another, it could merely get you canceled. In another, it could merely get you frowned at. Those kinds of cultural differences are going to determine the strength of the incentive. In that case, there could be ecological differences. In some cultures, pathogens might be more prevalent and dangerous, so the incentives of behaving in a hygienic way are going to be stronger in those cultures. Poorer cultures are going to have different incentive structures surrounding institutions of reciprocity and risk pooling that reduce the risk of starvation or deprivation. Stuff like that. That makes sense?
Mhm. Yes, it makes perfect sense. And one very interesting example of an incentive that I guess we have in all human societies, of course, it manifests in different ways, but I imagine it should be present in all human societies, is that we feel the need or we feel the want to look virtuous to other people. So, could you explain that? First of all, what does virtuosity mean, particularly from an evolutionary perspective, and then why do we want to look virtuous to other people?
Sure. I think of virtue as roughly desirability as a social partner. I think our concept of virtue probably refers more to the cooperative aspects of
Yeah.
social relationships. So, if I'm going to be fair with you in dividing resources, if I'm going to be honest with you and not lie to you or cheat you or manipulate you, if I'm going to be kind to you and generous to you and share resources with you, those are generally the types of things that we talk about when we talk about virtue. So I think of virtue as your value as a cooperative partner. And because we live in a social marketplace where we get to choose between potential cooperative partners and invest in some cooperative relationships over other cooperative relationships, it behooves us to signal our value as a cooperative partner so that people will want to partner with us and not partner with our rivals. So we are constantly competing to display our virtue, not just in an absolute sense, but in a relative sense. That is, we want to look more virtuous than our competitors in the social marketplace. So there is a competition for moral superiority. And we find tons of clever and creative ways to signal our virtue to one another, and in turn to see through those signals as bullshit occasionally.
Would this constitute an example of a status game then?
Yeah, I think virtue games are a kind of status game.
Mhm.
Will Storr has a wonderful book where he talks about status games, and he carves it up into three different categories: success games, virtue games, and dominance games. I think that's a pretty good way of carving it up. I might add a few more, like surrounding, say, epistemic status games. I think is another
Mhm.
one. But yeah, I think that's a pretty good way to carve it up.
Epistemic status games, what does that mean exactly? Would that be something that you find among, for example, intellectuals and academics?
Yeah, I think so. So we trust certain sources of information more than others. We deem them more credible, more reliable, more trustworthy.
Mhm. Okay.
And there are huge benefits to being seen as a credible and reliable source of information. There are benefits to being seen as reasonable and rational. And so a lot of the status games that intellectuals play with one another are competitions to be more reasonable, more thoughtful, more epistemically credible and reliable, more meticulous. Those types of competitions. There's actually a surprising scarcity of academic literature on epistemic status games. I feel like there should be tons more on this topic, but I think it's because it's the water that intellectuals swim in that they have a hard time seeing it.
So one thing that you mentioned in your not your paper, your post, is that when trying to look virtuous, at the same time we have to seem humble. So how do we go about doing that? What kinds of strategies do we employ?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard to do, as you can imagine, to look virtuous without looking like you were trying to look virtuous. It's a pretty difficult hoop to jump through.
Yeah.
But we find all sorts of clever and creative ways of jumping through it. There's a hilarious episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm where Ted Danson donates anonymously, I think it was to an art museum, and then he proceeds to tell everyone that he was the person who donated anonymously, thereby obviating his anonymous donation. And yet he still got tons of status, and he got extra status for donating anonymously. And by that, by that logic, he upstaged his rival Larry David, who donated conspicuously by putting his name on the wing. And so Ted Danson ended up gaining more status than Larry because he donated anonymously and then told everyone that he donated anonymously. So that's one type of maneuver we might make, is we might do good deeds anonymously or at least discreetly or inconspicuously and hope that some people pick up on that. And the people who do pick up on that will give us extra status for having done it inconspicuously or anonymously or discreetly.
And do incentives tie in any way to morality? What does it mean to be good or bad?
Yeah, no, I think morality is just another kind of incentive structure. I think morality can be pretty cleanly reduced to the virtue game, the competition to look virtuous and fair and trustworthy. It might not exhaust all of morality, but I think it's a pretty good chunk of it is just competing to look like a virtuous person. And
Mhm.
obviously, we compete in ways that try to show that we don't care about competing for virtue, as I just discussed. But yeah, I think of morality as largely a kind of virtue game.
And do we have any conscious access to all of this information? I mean, do we understand or do we have conscious access to the fact that we are behaving this way with this kind of motives behind our behavior or not?
Absolutely not. Yeah, no. In fact, not only are we unaware of it, I think it is often detrimental to us to become aware of it. So, as I mentioned earlier, becoming aware of the fact that we're playing a status game can sometimes make that status game collapse and invert the existing hierarchy. So, being aware of our status seeking um, can often hinder our desire for status. It can lower our status insofar as we are seen as a status seeker. And so, in order to deceive other people that we don't really care about status, we often deceive ourselves in order to more effectively deceive others. Or in our attempt to deceive others, we often inadvertently deceive ourselves as well. So, I think a lot of these things go on in the dark, covertly. So we convince ourselves through sacred narratives that what we're really pursuing is some sacred value, like knowledge or beauty or authenticity or equality or self-actualization or something that sounds lovely. And we convince ourselves that that's the thing we're pursuing, not status. And then we compete to show each other that we care more about the sacred value than any other selfish pursuit. And the competition is itself a kind of status competition, but nobody knows that it's a status competition. And if they did know, then it would collapse, and it would be most damaging to those who are winning in the status game or who have achieved high status already. And it might be most beneficial to those who are lower status in the game and feel like they're not getting the status they're entitled to. And that can give rise to strategic cynicism, whereby people try to make a status game collapse in order to increase their relative standing and put others down. This all gets very complicated, as you might imagine. But
Yeah.
that's just a taste of the way I'm thinking about it.
But even if we don't have conscious access to all of these underlying motives and what goes around in our psychology to produce the kinds of behaviors that we exhibit, I guess that we still need explanations for our behavior. I guess that even primarily because we also need to sometimes explain our own behavior and our motives to other people because other people need explanations. But also, I guess that even psychologically speaking, for our own psychological well-being, we also need to sort of integrate things within a personal narrative of some kind. I mean, do you agree with that? And if so, I mean, those kinds of narratives that we might create, what functions do they serve?
Yeah. So one function, as I mentioned, is just keeping our status games stable, keeping them from
Yeah.
collapsing or inverting. And that is often more in the interests of higher status people than lower status or embittered people, which is why you might expect lower status or embittered people to favor more cynical and nihilistic ideas that challenge the prevailing sacred narratives. Um, sorry, could you repeat the question? Because I feel like I got sidetracked.
Yeah, no, no problem. So I was asking you basically if the kinds of narratives that we feel the need to elaborate to tell other people about our own behavior and the
Mhm.
motives behind it, and also to tell ourselves due to, I don't know, psychological for psychological well-being or something like that. What kinds of functions do those narratives serve?
Got it. What are the functions? Yeah. So yeah, one of them is
Yeah.
stabilizing our status games. Another is just gaining status itself. So
Yeah.
if I do something unethical or unflattering, it is in
Yeah.
my interest to try to paint what I did in the most flattering possible terms. And in my efforts to convince other people that what I did wasn't so bad, I might convince myself as a tactic for more effectively convincing others in the same way that an attorney might practice their opening statement in front of a mirror before they enter the courtroom. We often practice our own opening statements in our minds, in the privacy of our own heads. That's what a lot of our fantasies and ruminations and obsessions are about, just playing out what we're going to say in our heads. And we in doing that often convince ourselves of all sorts of things, and that helps us to more effectively convince others if and when we're ever put on the stand or put on trial, so to speak. So that's another function of them. There are probably other functions. I think coordination may be one of them. All of us getting on the same page. Status games themselves depend on coordination. We all need to agree on what is high status or what is low status. And you could imagine that being pretty damaging if I am discoordinated with other people about that. If I end up praising and admiring a social pariah, or if I end up dissing and insulting a widely regarded person, that is going to be very bad for me. So we all need to coordinate on what the rules of our status game are.
Mhm.
Um, so status games are largely a coordination problem, and I think lots of um, myths and narratives are also coordination strategies. Often, it is more important for us to coordinate with one another and get on the same page with one another than it is to coordinate with reality itself.
But even if we don't have a conscious access to our own underlying incentives, when we think about, for example, people we like versus people we don't like, or another example would be political parties that we like versus political parties that are opposed to them, for example, we tend to frame things in terms of incentives, right? So, and how do we go about doing that when it comes to what we like versus what we don't like?
Yeah, so when we talk about likable people or unlikable people or heroes and villains, I think a lot of this incentive talk goes out the window. Because if you think about it, there's a pretty basic conflict between incentive-based thinking and Manichaean good versus evil thinking, which is that it increases your sympathy for the bad guys and lowers your praise and esteem for the good guys. If the bad guys are just bad because they were incentivized to be bad, well, then it doesn't, make much sense to hate them and demonize them, or at least as much. And if the good guys are just good because they're incentivized to be good because it's in their self-interest to be good, well, then you kind of lose some of your admiration for them. And because coalitions compete with each other by coordinating more effectively and thinking of themselves as superior to rival groups in order to bolster commitment to the group and prevent defection to other groups, it is often in coalitions' interests to spread these kinds of self-glorifying, other demonizing narratives um, to help them compete with other groups. And I think in creating those narratives, uh, incentives go out the window, and in some cases they're even taboo to acknowledge.
And you mentioned the term likable at a certain point there. So, what makes a person likable?
I could go on all day here. I mean, we are one of the judgiest, probably the judgiest species on the planet. The number of traits and dimensions on which we judge each other is enormous and bewildering.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, I could go on all day. Honesty, kindness, fairness, generosity, bravery, loyalty, cleverness, sense of humor, self-awareness. I could go on all day.
But I mean, what makes a person likable at the end of the day, isn't it basically doing the right things or saying and doing the right things? Isn't that it, basically?
Yeah. So if you think in terms of this social marketplace perspective, where we're picking and choosing different social partnerships to invest in,
Yeah.
and we're evaluating people based on their value as a social partner, then yeah, one of the main sources of information we attend to when evaluating social partners is language, is what people are saying. That's
Yeah.
a pretty good heuristic a lot of the times for picking up on a lot of these cues. What are people talking about? Who are they displaying loyalty to? Who are they displaying hostility to? What kinds of traits can be inferred based on the words that they use? And so one of the biggest um, sources of our social decision making and our social evaluations just come from what people say, whether they're saying the right things or the wrong things. And you know, if they're saying the right things, we like them. If they're saying the wrong things, we don't like them. And that incentivizes us to say the right things to get people to like us, and to avoid saying the wrong things to avoid eliciting others' dislike.
And how do we determine what are the right things to say and do?
Whatever uh, wins us likability points, whatever gets people to like us. We often use our own judgments of others to simulate how others will judge us. So things that we will judge positively in other people, we will engage in those same behaviors ourselves. So if I like people who say progressive things, or who say things that are supportive of progressive ideology, chances are other people are going to like me for saying those same progressive things. So I'm going to be motivated to say those things to get other people to like me more, and to uh, win the various status games that I'm playing with my peers.
But that happens if you are included in a circle of mostly progressive people, right? Because if it's mostly conservative, I would imagine that you saying progressive things wouldn't garner you much status or likability, right?
Yes, absolutely. So it's going to depend on your particular social environment and what particular types of words and deeds are rewarded in your social environment. Yeah.
So moving on to the other post, I would like to ask you about today, where you talk about opinions, and the title is "Opinions Are Bullshit." So, what is an opinion anyway? Because I was thinking until I read your article or your post that it was just a preference. When we talk about opinions, we would be talking about preferences, but you argue in a different way. So, could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think they're not just preferences. I think, they're
Okay.
partly preferences. I think that's part of what's going on with our opinions, but it's not the whole story. And that's just because we already know how to talk about our preferences. We have a whole language for talking about our preferences. We say, I like this, or I don't like this. I don't care for this. Um, so if opinions were just preferences, then we would not need the language of opinions, right? We would just talk about what we like and what we don't like, and that would be it. And
Okay.
if you bring the language of opinions into our preferences, it sounds weird. So if I say something like, "It is my strongly held opinion that I like cilantro," that sounds really weird, doesn't it? Wouldn't you just say, "I like cilantro"? Like, why do you need to say it's your opinion? Like, what additional information does that bring into it? Right? So opinions have to be something more than just preferences. And so, what I think opinions are preferences combined with a set of positive judgments about the type of people who hold those preferences and a set of negative judgments about the people who don't hold those preferences. So, me saying I like cilantro is not an opinion. But me saying I like cilantro and the people who like cilantro have a more sophisticated palate and are more discerning and are smarter and more authentic and have better taste in food, and the people who don't like cilantro are Philistines, they're barbarous, and their taste in food should not be respected. Then all of a sudden, those additional judgments I'm making, those bring my preference for cilantro into the realm of opinion. So opinions are preferences combined with a set of social judgments about the people who hold those preferences or lack those preferences.
But because different people have different opinions, I mean, does it have anything to do with some of our psychological predispositions, like, for example, different personality traits and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Our preferences are certainly shaped by our personality traits, by random genetically heritable dispositions. They're also shaped by a variety of cultural and environmental sources. Often, what we prefer will be socially incentivized in our social environment. If I get status for being a wine snob, I'm going to be more likely to develop a taste for wine, and in particular, the fancier kinds of wine. So, yeah, preferences are multiply determined from various both biological and cultural and environmental sources.
But particularly when we express an opinion that deviates from the majority opinion, if we express certain minority tastes, for example, do you think that has anything to do with the actual quality of the things they refer to, or is it something else?
Um, that could be part of what's going on, but I think
Okay.
people are going to be very biased to think that about their opinions, because the point of expressing an opinion, I think, is to shape social norms in our favor. So at this point, it might be helpful to backtrack and think about what norms are. I
Mhm.
think norms are just widely shared opinions. You could think of opinions as pieces or fragments of norms. And when everyone shares the same opinion, you get a full fledged norm. So if opinions are just the judgments we make about other people based on their preferences, then when we all share the same opinion, then we're all going to make the same judgments about each other based on what we do. So if we all share the opinion that McDonald's is great, that McDonald's eaters are authentic and honest and blunt, and they tell it like it is, and they don't virtue signal, well, that's going to create a social norm among our group to like and eat at McDonald's. If I like and eat at McDonald's, I'm going to gain status points in our group. I'm going to be judged as honest and blunt and authentic and anti virtue signaling. And if I rant about McDonald's as an evil corporation, then I'm going to lose status points in our group. So those victories and losses and status are basically what we talk about when we talk about norms. A norm is just what we gain status for doing and what we lose status for not doing. Um, I hope I said that correctly. And yeah, so backtracking. So if opinions are widely, sorry, if norms are widely shared opinions, what we're doing when we express our opinion is we're trying to shape social norms in our favor. Then that means that when we express our opinions, we're going to be biased in all sorts of ways because we're going to want to shape social norms in ways that advance our self-interest and that boost our status and that lower our rivals' status. In order to win the opinion game and change social norms, we're going to have to make our opinions look more objective than they really are. So we're going to have to argue that our opinions are actually rooted in some objective feature of reality. So if I like a particular kind of music, I'm going to argue that it's objectively good. And if you can't see that, then you must be dumb or unsophisticated or have bad taste in music, or maybe you're too biased and conformist. Maybe you're not authentic enough like me. In order to express my opinion about that particular type of music, I'm going to have to diss either implicitly or explicitly the people who don't like that music. And if I'm successful, then I can make liking that music a new kind of social norm. And that benefits
Mhm.
me because I'm the person who discovered that band. I'm the person who liked that music, and that's going to boost my status. And all this is going to occur independently of whether my arguments are correct. So I could be totally wrong about the music. It could be that you don't need to be smart or sophisticated at all to see that particular thing, or maybe that particular thing isn't actually that impressive or skillful, or maybe the music isn't actually that good, and I'm the one who's biased by conformity or status seeking or whatever. These kinds of considerations are kind of ignored when we express our opinions, because the goal is not to accurately describe what we're talking about or accurately describe reality. The goal is to win the opinion game and transform our preferences into social norms. So yeah, it could be the case that if you like indie music or indie movies, you might be correct about some feature of those movies, but I think it's pretty unlikely given our biases to win the opinion game. Our motivation is to win the opinion game, not to accurately describe reality.
Mhm. But isn't it, at least to some extent, aren't we also looking for, at, I mean, particularly in certain social circles, to distinguish ourselves from other people? And then, I mean, I'm not sure if in those particular cases the objective or the goal would be to turn our opinions into social norms, but to turn our opinions into something that people recognize as being superior to what is even normative or common, right? But that happens a lot, and though that is one of the ways by which we acquire status if we play that game well, right?
Yeah. So I think what you're talking about is ultimately the same as a norm. So if we all think that a
Okay.
certain preference is superior, say Radiohead is superior to Taylor Swift, then that is identical to saying that liking Radiohead is a social norm. I now have a social incentive to say I like Radiohead and to say I don't like Taylor Swift. If I say I like Taylor Swift and hate Radiohead, that's going to lower my status. That's going to cost me social points. And so those winnings and losings of social points, those are what norms are. If we all think something is superior, then that creates a norm for us to say we like that thing. So yeah, I view them as identical.
Mhm. But social norms, we can have different social norms for different social groups or social circles, right? Because I mean, if I am a Swiftie, of course, for me and for people who are part of my group, Taylor Swift will be the best artist ever. But if I prefer, if I'm part of another social group, maybe it's Radiohead and so on and so forth, right? So
Mhm.
also because we see that in our society, for example, it is very common for intellectuals or people who identify as intellectual to have particular tastes when it comes to, for example, art that are very different from tastes of common people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's going to be powerfully shaped by the nature of our social networks. But any social network is not going to be 100% homogenous. So yeah, if I'm a Swiftie, I'm going to hang out with other Swifties probably. But it's not that everyone I know in my social network is going to be a Swiftie. And it would still benefit me to convince those other people in my social network that I'm superior for being a Swiftie, right? Because then I get my status raised and other Swifties get their status raised and my group gets its status raised. And so that's still in my interest. So I might try to talk the non-Swifties in my social network into being a Swiftie, or at least giving some status to Swifties and Taylor Swift's music. Same thing might go for the particular tastes and preferences of intellectuals. Yeah, intellectuals are going to hang out with each other, but they might hang out with some people who are not in that circle or not uh, intellectuals per se, and they might try to wax poetic about the value of knowledge and the beauty of their theories and how they're what they're doing is making the world a better place, and how ideas matter and determine the course of history and yada yada yada.
But how do norms or how do opinions become norms? How are norms established, basically?
Yeah, so usually it takes a high status or charismatic or politically powerful person to get on their soapbox, express their opinions, and then cause other people to shift their opinions toward the high status person. So if everybody loves me, everyone is going to be biased to copy what I do in order to endear themselves to me. They're going to be biased to agree with whatever I say in order to get closer to me. So, in that way, norms bend toward the interests of high status people. If I'm high status, my opinions are going to be more highly respected. People are going to listen to my opinions, and they're going to be more likely to share my opinions merely because I'm high status, right? Another aspect of it is political power or network power. The more people I have who will listen to me, the more likely my opinions are going to win out in the opinion game. If I get to shout my opinions on a megaphone to thousands of people, or if I have a popular Substack that thousands of people read, or if I write a column in the New York Times that most of America reads, I'm going to have a pretty big effect on the prevailing opinions and the prevailing norms in my culture. So a lot of it just comes down to norms bending toward the interests of the high status and the powerful. But to be a bit more hopeful, part of it could come from the genuinely better opinions rising to the top in the competition to win the opinion game. So if I have genuinely better arguments that the food I like or the music I listen to or the movies I prefer are actually better in some way, maybe they convey the skill of the artist more effectively, or maybe they create better social incentives, maybe they uplift us and inspire us to be better people in some way. If I'm right about that, and I have good arguments about that, well, then my opinion might naturally rise to the top as people see it as just more persuasive. Um, if a particular food is unhealthy and it really is unhealthy, well, then it's probably my opinion that the food is bad is going to be more likely to win the opinion game, insofar as the evidence of that food's ill health effects are undeniable. So there is some room for good ideas to win out, but it's going to be heavily biased by the interests of high status and powerful people, as most things are.
That's very interesting. So, would you say that this sort of opinion game also plays out in science? Like, science at the end of the day is basically people with different, in this particular case, we're going to call them opinions instead of hypotheses, for example,
Mm.
but people with different hypotheses, and the way we arrive at those hypotheses, I mean, in this case, it could be a lot of different things. We could just have particular psychological predispositions to prefer one explanation to the other, or perhaps we come from a different framework and we want to acquire status through that framework, and so we want that framework to be the correct one. I mean,
Mhm.
so we also see this playing out in science as an institution, right? It's not really, or perhaps at the end of the day, if we are honest with ourselves, it's not really about people really wanting to figure out the truth, but perhaps it's that kind of game playing out, and then later it's when eventually we figure out the truth, right?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought a lot about whether the opinion game applies to science, but I think
Yeah.
it may well apply. So I do agree that science is a status game, and
Yeah.
it's a particular kind of status game that truth emerges from over time, and that's what makes it so wonderful and beneficial to us. But at the end of the game, it still is a status game. Scientists gain status for making new discoveries and advancing new theories that end up being judged as correct. And so you could think of scientific hypotheses and theories as opinions, insofar as the scientist makes negative judgments about the people who agree with that theory and
Yeah.
positive judgments about the people who agree with that theory and negative judgments about the people who disagree with that theory. Then you could call that theory an opinion. And it sort of makes sense that if I think my theory is objectively correct and insightful, and you don't see that, well, why don't you see that? Maybe you're not as smart as me. Maybe you're not as insightful or sophisticated as me. Or maybe you're biased in some way. Maybe you're biased to fit in with your subculture. Maybe you're biased by your politics. Maybe you're biased because you studied under a particular person and you want to gain status with that person, independent of whether their ideas are correct. So there could be all sorts of negative inferences I might make about you for rejecting my theory. So in that case, insofar as I'm making those judgments about you, and I'm making positive judgments about myself for being smart and insightful enough to devise that theory, then you could call that theory an opinion. And insofar as that opinion wins out in the opinion game, and people recognize that it is correct and it is insightful, well, people will start to gain status for adhering to the theory, for believing in it and endorsing it. And people will start to lose status for rejecting it or questioning it or being skeptical of it. So you could maybe argue that science is a kind of opinion game, and it is a special kind of opinion game with an incentive structure that particularly allows for the truest ideas to win, as opposed to the highest status ideas. Now, of course, there are some biases along those lines, even in science. So there are fads in science. There are high status or prestigious theories or ways of looking at things. And so these social and political elements can distort the search for truth. The prevailing theories will often bend toward the interests of the intelligentsia and the politically powerful and the high status. And so that is a huge bias that we try to overcome with science. But the hope is that that bias will be overcome and the truest ideas will ultimately win out.
Yeah, but that came to my mind. I mean, and it's very interesting if it is true that science works that way, because I mean, if people really are like this, and we have these sort of motives, and we play status games or opinion games in in this specific case, then if we are to be realistic, then people work like that, and they are not really trying to be, or they aren't even objective in terms of their search, their supposed search for truth. They aren't impartial. They are very much biased. They are very much partial. But that's the way the game works, and that's what eventually leads to truth. So at the end of the day, if that's the way things work, it's a good thing, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, I agree. I'm a social scientist, so I believe in it, in the institution, at least to some extent. Obviously, there are many problems in it, and there are many ways in which the search for truth can be damaged and corrupted and subverted. And I could go on all day about the ways in which it is. But at the end of the day, there's still some sliver of hope that the best ideas will prevail. I think the mechanism that leads to true and useful ideas is probably more powerful in the natural and physical sciences than it is in the social sciences, sadly, just because there are stronger biases at play in the social sciences, because it's a science of us and we have lots of strong opinions about us. The great Robert Trivers once said that the greater the social content of a discipline, the slower its progress. I think that is a deep insight. I think that is correct.
Yeah.
And I think that is why other sciences have gotten us to the moon and social sciences have gotten us to a replication crisis. Which isn't to say that other fields haven't had replication crises as well. But I think I do agree with Trivers that there are unique problems in the social sciences and in any discipline that touches on human affairs. I think once those sciences do touch on socially contentious topics, the search for truth can often be corrupted in various ways.
Well, I mean, but maybe this would be a great idea for one of your upcoming Substack posts. Maybe you could write something like figuring out the truth, or wanting to figure out the truth is bullshit, because that's not what people really want. I mean, that ends up happening, but it's not the primary motive. Right.
Yes, exactly. Scientists like to tell themselves that it's their primary motive, but I don't think it is. I think it is a byproduct of the institution when it's working well, but it's not the goal of any individual scientist. And that might be a depressing thing to hear, but I think it's ultimately a correct description of human psychology.
Yep. So let me just ask you one last question, because earlier when we were talking about incentives and narratives specifically, at a certain point I mentioned that we need narratives also because we need explanations to give to other people. So in the particular case of opinions, do you think that when we present arguments to other people as to why our preferences are better, do you think that, again, we are really trying to figure out the truth, or that we are trying to convince other people that we are right to acquire status?
I think that's the latter. We're trying to convince other people that we're right. But there are
Yeah.
some cases where the only way to convince other people that we're right is to say true and convincing and compelling
But,
things. That's going to depend on the nature of your social environment. And it's going to depend on what other people find persuasive, whether they find good arguments persuasive and strong evidence persuasive, or whether they find uh, status persuasive, independent of the power of the arguments. So yeah, it's going to depend. But yeah, I don't want to say that you know truth is plays zero role in our opinions.
mhm. No. Yeah,
I think there's a
and I
difference
mean,
between yeah.
oh no, no, no,
Just
sorry, you were just cut off for a few seconds there. You were saying that you don't want to say that truth doesn't matter at all, or something along those lines.
yeah, just if the goal is to convince someone, um, then you're going to have to say things that the other person will find convincing. Often you can
Mhm.
convince people by saying untrue things.
Yeah,
Often you can convince them by not caring about the truth and just appealing to your superior status or your superior wisdom,
yeah.
or by intimidating them into thinking that if they don't agree with you, then bad things will happen to them. Those are alternative means of persuading someone. But one of the means by which we persuade someone is by just making good arguments and trying to appeal to what is out there that they can see. So yeah, I don't want to say that 0% of our opinions or our arguments are related or connected to the truth. But I do want to say that the percentage is lower than we might like to think.
So when it comes to science specifically, I guess that at the end of the day, what we really need there are good incentives, right? Because if people have proper incentives, and if we have proper norms set in place that I mean that tend to lead us toward truth, then science works better, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you could think about the incentives that led to the replication crisis as being a bad set of incentives.
Mhm.
So you get lots of prestige in science currently, and ideally, hopefully less so, but certainly before the replication crisis, you got lots of status for making a big, flashy, counterintuitive discovery. And you got no status at all for trying to replicate other people's work. And so that created an incentive for pumping out lots of low quality studies that gave flashy and counterintuitive results, and no work at all trying to replicate those results. So that would be an example of a perverse incentive structure, where in that case you gain status for obscuring the truth rather than finding it. And
Yeah.
currently, there are efforts to try to correct those incentives. So there are multiple projects being undertaken to try to replicate others' work. There are institutions for trying to reward replication work with greater status. Journals are starting to publish replication work more frequently than they used to. There are incentives for not p-hacking, so for pre-registering your hypotheses so that you can't, twiddle with the statistics until you get the result you want. You have to say what statistics you're going to run in advance and then run those exact statistics. So that's another positive development. Um, Sample sizes have gotten larger, uh, which is good. Um, I think we're correctly focusing more on effect sizes rather than p-values. This is more in the weeds here, but I think lots of positive developments have taken place in the wake of the replication crisis to try to correct these incentives so that the truth will emerge more effectively. There's still plenty of work to be done. There's still plenty of problems, but I think it's headed in the right direction.
And so, and this will be my last question. Do you think that then, if people, scientists, philosophers of science, were aware of this more evolutionary take on incentives and opinions, that perhaps they would develop better and new ways of doing science?
Well, it is my opinion that that is correct, and it is, of course, my self-serving opinion, as most opinions are, that that is correct because I'm an evolutionary psychologist, and so touting the virtues of evolutionary psychology is in my status interests. But yes, despite the fact that this opinion is self-interested, I do think it is correct. I think um, the best or perhaps the only way to understand human nature, the human condition, is by viewing it correctly as the product of natural selection. I think that is the source of humanity. That is where we come from. I find it baffling that people think that when trying to study the structure and function of an evolved organ, it is okay to not think about the process that made that organ. I continue to be baffled by it. I think it is one of the great distortionary pressures in science that evolutionary psychology is not common sense at this point, that viewing the human animal in evolutionary terms, whether cultural evolution or biological evolution, whatever, I don't have a dog in that fight. Any kind of evolution applied to the human animal is going to deepen and enrich our understanding of the human animal. And the fact that this perspective has not caught on and become fully mainstream is deeply saddening. Nevertheless, there is some hope. There has been some progress made. Evolutionary perspectives have gotten considerably more mainstream than they have been in the past few decades. It has gotten more respectable, more prestigious. Evolutionary psychology papers are getting published in the top journals more and more. People are more frequently viewing it as a legitimate and powerful perspective to take. There is progress. It's slower than I would hope it would be, but there is progress being made.
So, where can people find you on the internet?
Well, you can find me at Twitter at David Pinsof. You can find my blog, Everything is Bullshit, at everythingisbullshit.blog. You can feel free to direct message me. Happy to answer any questions and chat.
Great. So, thank you so much for doing this again. It's also very fun to talk with you.
Yep, my pleasure, Ricardo.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsof, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.